The Vox grill crackled with static in the subterranean archives beneath the Terran Palace, 3 kilometers below the throne room where the Master of Mankind sits locked in his eternal vigil. Lexographer Tertius Valen had served the administratum for 47 years, his augmetic eyes scanning forbidden texts that would drive lesser minds to screaming madness. Yet nothing in 4 decades of service had prepared him for the data slate that now trembled in his withered hands. The parchment was older than the Imperium itself, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Imperial aquila in a configuration that had not been used since the Unification Wars, and when he broke that seal, the smell of promethium and something else, something organic and wrong, filled his nostrils like the breath of a dying world. The first line read simply, "She was the 11th, and she should never have been." Valen's heart, half organic and struggling even with augmetic support, hammered against his ribcage. He had heard the whispers, of course. Every scholar who delved deep enough into the foundations of Imperial history encountered them eventually. Those gaps in the record where 2 names should have stood, 2 legions that had been struck from every chronicle, every monument, every scrap of remembrance with a thoroughness that suggested not mere censure, but something far more desperate. The 2nd and the 11th, the lost and the purged. But this spoke of something else entirely, a third silence beneath the 2 that were acknowledged, however obliquely, in the hushed conversations of those few who dared to question the official histories. The document continued in High Gothic so archaic that Valen had to cross-reference 3 separate translation matrices to parse its meaning, and what emerged from that linguistic archaeology was a story that made his augmetic hands shake with a tremor no amount of mechanical precision could suppress. There had been another, the text claimed, a Primarch whose very existence had been deemed so dangerous, so incompatible with the Imperium's emerging doctrine, that her removal from history had been absolute, not censure, not purge, complete erasure, as though she had never drawn breath beneath the Emperor's laboratory lights, never opened her eyes to behold the face of her Creator, never spoken a word or taken a single step across the red sands of terror. But she had. The document insisted she had. The atmospheric processors in the archive chamber hummed with a frequency that set Valen's teeth on edge as he read deeper, his eyes scanning words that should not exist, descriptions that defied everything he understood about the Primarch project. She had been the 11th to gestate, the records claimed, grown in a gestation pod adjacent to those of her brothers, formed from the same gene seed source, the same impossible fusion of science and sorcery that had birthed the 20 godlings who would lead humanity's reconquest of the stars. But her development had diverged from her siblings in ways the Emperor's gene rights had not anticipated. Modifications written into her genetic code at a level so fundamental that even the Master of Mankind himself had struggled to predict their final expression. Where her brothers were engines of war incarnate, built for conquest and domination, and the brutal necessities of galactic compliance, she had been designed for something else entirely. The documents used a word in Proto-Gothic that Valen's translation matrix struggled to render, finally settling on synthesis, though that felt inadequate, too small to contain the concept the ancient text was trying to convey. She was meant to be the bridge. The text suggested the one who could speak not only to humanity, but to the things humanity had forgotten it once was, before old night, before the age of strife, when mankind had walked among the stars with Xenos races in something that was not quite friendship, but was certainly not the genocidal hatred that now defined imperial policy. The very idea was heresy of such profound depth that Valen should have stopped reading immediately, should have sealed the document and reported its existence to the Inquisition. Let them determine whether it was genuine or some elaborate forgery designed to sow doubt and confusion among the faithful. But he did not stop, could not stop, because buried in those archaic phrases and fragmentary descriptions was something that sang with the terrible ring of truth, a narrative that explained so many of the inconsistencies that had plagued his research over the decades, so many of the gaps that did not quite align with the official explanations. She had been beautiful, the text claimed. though it struggled to define what that meant in the context of a being who stood 3 meters tall and had been engineered for purposes beyond mortal comprehension. Not beautiful in the way a sculpture is beautiful, all perfect proportions and idealized features, but beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, in the way the edge of a blade catches light, in the way a piece of music can make you weep without understanding why. Her features had been sharp where her brothers were broad, elegant where they were brutal, and her eyes. One of the gene writes had noted in a margin annotation that had somehow survived the purge. Her eyes held something that made him think of autumn leaves falling on Terra before the world burned, a melancholy that seemed woven into her very being. They had called her Alessandra, though whether that was a name the Emperor had given her or one she had chosen for herself the document did not specify. Alessandra. Even thinking the name felt transgressive, like speaking a curse backwards or drawing the Imperial ocula with the wrong number of heads. But the name fit the fragmentary descriptions, fit the sense of something graceful and fierce, and ultimately doomed, that emanated from every word of the ancient text. Valen turned the page, the parchment crackling with age, and found himself staring at a schematic that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a gene structure diagram, the kind the Mechanicus used to map the impossibly complex biological architecture of the Primarchs, and it showed Alessandra's genetic code branching away from her brothers in subtle but profound ways. Where they had been given enhancements that amplified aggression, tactical acumen, and physical dominance, she had received modifications that heightened empathy, pattern recognition, and something the diagram labeled in cramped script as psycho-adaptive resonance, a phrase that meant nothing to Valen but felt heavy with implication. The Emperor, the text suggested, had created her as a solution to a problem he had foreseen but not yet shared with his gene rights or his Thunder Warriors, or even the nascent Primarchs gestating in their pods around her. Humanity's conquest of the galaxy would require more than mere military might, more than the application of overwhelming force to every world that resisted compliance. It would require someone who could negotiate, who could understand the alien perspective without being corrupted by it, who could make the hard choices about which xeno-species might be integrated into the Imperium as client races and which had to be exterminated for the safety of mankind. She was meant to be the diplomat, the synthesizer, the one who could stand before the Elder or the Terrellians or the Diasporex and find common ground, where her brothers saw only targets for bolter rounds and virus bombs. In a different galaxy, under different circumstances, she might have been the architect of a genuine Pax Humana, a peace built not on fear and submission, but on actual understanding between species. But the galaxy was not different, and the circumstances were exactly as they were, and Alessandra's existence had lasted exactly 372 days from the moment she emerged from her gestation pod to the moment she died. The manner of her death occupied 17 pages of the document, written in a hand that grew increasingly erratic as the narrative progressed, as though the scribe had been documenting events that were actively traumatizing him even as his stylus moved across the parchment. Valen read those pages with a growing sense of horror that transcended the merely intellectual and became something visceral, something that made his stomach turn and his augmetic heart skip irregular beats that should have been impossible for a mechanical system. She had been discovered, the account began, on a world in the Segmentum Pacificus that no longer existed, its name redacted so thoroughly that not even a number designation remained. The Emperor had dispatched a recovery fleet the moment his psychic senses detected her awakening. The same protocol he would follow for each of her brothers, as they scattered across the galaxy in the wake of the Chaos God's interference with the Primarch project. But when the ships arrived in orbit and sent down the initial survey teams, what they found was not the warrior queen or the warlord king that the other Primarchs had inevitably become in their exile. They found her in a city of crystal and light, walking among xenos whose species the Imperium would later classify as harmless herbivores, completely non-threatening and marked for extermination only because the doctrine of human supremacy admitted no exceptions. She had been raised by these creatures, had learned their language and their customs, had been shaped by their philosophy of cooperation and symbiosis rather than conquest and dominance. When the Imperial delegation approached her, when they explained who she was and where she had come from and what destiny awaited her among the stars, she had listened with those autumn leaf eyes and then asked a single question that should have been simple, but was in fact the most complicated thing anyone had ever asked the Emperor's representatives. Why must they die? The delegation had tried to explain. They had used all the arguments that seemed so compelling when shouted from a crusade fleet's command deck. All the logical reasoning about humanity's right to the galaxy, about the dangers of the Xenos, about the necessity of human supremacy for the species' survival. Alessandra had listened to every word, had considered their arguments with a mind that was among the finest ever created, capable of processing information at speeds that would shame even the most sophisticated cogitator. And then she had given them her answer. No. That single syllable had changed everything. Not a tantrum, not a reasoned counter-argument, not a plea for more time to prepare her adopted people for evacuation or cultural integration. Just a flat refusal to accept the fundamental premise upon which the entire Imperium was being constructed. The Xenos of this world had shown her kindness, had raised her with love and care, had given her a childhood that her brothers had been largely denied in their various savage exiles, and she would not repay that kindness with extermination. The standoff had lasted for days. The Emperor himself had eventually descended to the planet's surface, had stood before his daughter in that crystal city, and attempted to explain the larger context she was missing, the dark truths about the galaxy that made his policy of Xenos extermination not merely preferable but absolutely necessary. He had shown her things. The text suggested vaguely visions of Xenos atrocities, memories of old night when alien races had preyed upon fragmented human worlds, glimpses of future timelines where humanity's mercy was repaid with slavery and extinction. Alessandra had wept, the account noted, tears running down her perfect face as she absorbed the terrible weight of galactic history, but she had not changed her answer. These people, her people, the creatures who had found her in her crash crater, and nursed her to health and raised her as their own. They were not responsible for the crimes of their species' distant cousins or for the atrocities of completely different Xenos empires. They deserved a chance, deserved to be judged on their own merits rather than condemned by association. The argument, by all accounts, had been titanic. Two beings of nearly godlike intellect, creator and creation, standing in a crystal plaza while the fate of an entire species hung in the balance. The Emperor had not been accustomed to being refused, especially not by one of his Primarchs, beings who were literally designed to serve as extensions of his will across the galaxy. But Alessandra was also a Primarch, with all the stubbornness and unshakable conviction that came with that nature, and she would not yield. In the end, it was not the Emperor who made the final decision, it was Alessandra herself. She had felt it coming, the text explained, her psycho-adaptive resonance giving her a sensitivity to the warp that exceeded even her brother's various psychic gifts. The fleet in orbit was preparing to enact exterminatus, to cleanse the world from orbit with cyclonic torpedoes and virus bombs, to erase the Xenos and the problem they represented in a tide of flame and disease that would render the planet lifeless for generations to come. The Emperor had given the order with the terrible certainty of one who sees no other path forward, who has calculated every variable and arrived at the conclusion that this loss, however tragic, is necessary for the greater good of the species. Alessandra had known she could not stop it, could not physically prevent the ships from firing, could not turn aside weapons that had been designed to crack continents and boil oceans. But she could do one thing, exercise one final choice that remained within her power. She could refuse to watch her people burn alone. The psychic scream that accompanied her death had been felt across the entire segmentum, a wave of anguish and defiance that rippled through the immaterium like a stone thrown into still water. She had not used a weapon, had not required a blade or a bolt round. She had simply stopped had ceased the fundamental biological processes that sustained even a Primarch's impossible physiology, had willed herself into non-existence with the same absolute conviction that she had refused the Emperor's command. The Xenos had died moments later, the virus bombs doing their work with their usual terrible efficiency, but by then Alessandra was already gone, collapsed in the center of the Crystal Plaza with her eyes still open, still showing that autumn leaf sorrow, still silently asking that question no one had been able to answer satisfactorily. Why must they die? Valen set down the data slate with trembling hands, the archive chamber suddenly feeling too small, the recycled air too thin. The document continued for dozens more pages, detailing the aftermath of that catastrophe. The Emperor's response, the measures taken to ensure that no record of Alessandra's existence would survive, that no one would ever know about the Primarch who had chosen death rather than complicity in genocide. The second and the 11th would be censured for other reasons, their own tragedies and failures, but they would at least be acknowledged as gaps in the record, as mysteries that provoked speculation and debate. Alessandra would be erased completely, her name struck from every database, her gene seed destroyed, her legion still in its infancy and not yet assigned to her command, scattered among her brother's forces or assigned to other duties where their origins would be forgotten. The Emperor, it was said, had carried her body back to Terra himself, had overseen her interment in a vault so deep and so secret that its location was known only to him, sealed behind wards that would outlast the Imperium itself. And in the millennia since, in the 10,000 years of endless war and gradual decay that had consumed the galaxy, she had been forgotten, not suppressed, not censured, simply forgotten, as though she had never existed at all, as though the gene pod that had gestated her had remained empty, as though the Emperor had created only 19 Primarchs instead of 20. But she had existed, and the document in Valen's hands proved it, and that proof was the most dangerous thing in the Imperium. The question that consumed him now, that made his mind race even as his body remained frozen in his archive chair, was what to do with this knowledge. The rational choice was obvious: destroy the document, purge it from his memory through psychic conditioning, pretend he had never seen it. The existence of Alessandra, if it became widely known, would undermine the very foundations of Imperial doctrine, would raise questions about the Emperor's judgment and the necessity of the Xenos purges that had defined human policy for 10 millennia. It would give ammunition to every heretic and Xenos lover who had ever questioned whether humanity's path of endless conquest and extermination was truly the only option available. But Valen was a scholar before he was a functionary, and scholars hated unanswered questions more than they feared the consequences of answering them. And this question, this mystery of the lost Primarch who had died rather than compromise her principles, it deserved to be known, even if knowing it was dangerous, even if the truth would cost him everything. He thought about her, about Alessandra, imagined what she might have been if things had been different, if the Emperor had been willing to accommodate even one dissenting voice among his Primarchs, if the Imperium had been built with room for mercy and negotiation instead of only conquest and submission. Would it have survived? Could a more tolerant Imperium have weathered the Horus heresy, the age of apostasy, the endless grinding wars that consumed humanity's resources and its hope? Or would it have been devoured by the first Xenos empire that saw kindness as weakness, mercy as opportunity? He would never know. No one would ever know, because that timeline had died with Alessandra in the Crystal Plaza, had been purged as thoroughly as the world that had raised her. The Imperium was what it was, brutal and xenophobic and utterly committed to human supremacy, and perhaps that was the only way humanity could have survived. Perhaps the Emperor had been right to give that order, right to prioritize the species' survival over the life of even one of his beloved children. But perhaps was not certainty, and doubt, once planted, was almost impossible to eradicate completely. Valen stood, his joints protesting the movement after hours seated in the archive chamber, and made his way through the labyrinthine corridors toward the surface, toward the light of day that filtered weakly through Terra's eternal smog layers. The document remained where he had left it, sealed once more, its secrets contained for now but not forgotten. He had memorized every word, every detail, had impressed the truth of Alessandra's existence onto his consciousness, where no mind wipe short of complete brain death could erase it. And he had made a decision, one that would likely cost him his life, but felt necessary nonetheless. He would leave clues, subtle traces scattered through his own research notes and observations, breadcrumbs that might lead other scholars to the same discovery he had made. Not obvious enough to trigger the Inquisition's interest, not blatant enough to be identified as heresy, just small inconsistencies and unexplained references that might, over decades or centuries, accumulate into a body of evidence that could not be ignored. The truth of Alessandra deserved to be known, even if it could never be officially acknowledged, even if it could only exist as whispers and rumors and unsubstantiated theories debated in the darkest corners of the Imperium's academic underworld. She had existed, had lived and chosen and died for principles that transcended mere survival, and that life, however brief, however thoroughly erased, mattered. As he emerged into the wan daylight of terror's perpetual twilight, Valen allowed himself a moment of speculation, wondering what Alessandra would make of the Imperium that had grown from her death, this vast machine of oppression and warfare that consumed entire worlds in its endless hunger for expansion. Would she see it as a terrible necessity, the only possible response to a hostile galaxy that offered humanity no quarter and no mercy? Or would she see it as a betrayal of everything intelligent life could be, a descent into barbarism justified by fear and legitimized through doctrine? The question hung in his mind as he walked through the crowded streets, past servitors and adepts and pilgrims come to glimpse the throne world, past monuments to heroes and victories, and the endless grinding triumph of Imperial arms. Somewhere beneath his feet, kilometers down in a vault that no one could find, Alessandra's body lay in eternal repose, the physical form of a question that could never be answered, a path not taken that haunted the Imperium like a ghost. The Primarchs were meant to be extensions of the Emperor's will, tools designed for conquest and compliance, and 19 of them, in various ways and to various degrees, had fulfilled that function. Even the traitor Primarchs, even Horus himself, had served the Emperor's purposes before their falls, had led their legions in wars of expansion and extermination that brought countless worlds into Imperial compliance. They were warriors and generals and, in their own brutal fashion, leaders who commanded absolute loyalty from their sons. But Alessandra had been something else, designed for a purpose that the galaxy as it existed could not accommodate, a dream of cooperation and synthesis that had died a-borning in the face of reality's harsh demands. She was the Primarch who might have been, the path the Imperium did not take, and her absence from history was as significant as the presence of her brothers, a negative space that shaped the narrative even as it remained invisible to those who did not know to look for it. Valen's thoughts turned to the Primarchs who remained, those few who still walked among humanity's scattered domains or existed in states between life and death, dream and waking. Robout Guillemont returned from his long stasis and now serving as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, attempting to hold together an edifice that groaned under its own weight. The Lion, recently awakened and reunited with his dark angels, bringing his own brand of uncompromising justice to a galaxy that seemed to have exhausted its capacity for mercy, and the others, dead or missing or transformed into something no longer quite recognizable as the beings they had been, each bearing the scars of 10,000 years of warfare and loss. Would they remember her, if they could? Did some fragment of their infant memories retain the sense of her presence in the gestation chambers, the feeling of another consciousness developing alongside theirs, different but recognizable as kin? The document had suggested that the Emperor had personally overseen the editing of their memories, removing any trace of Alessandra from their consciousness, but Primarchs were not easily tampered with, even by their creator. Perhaps somewhere in the depths of their superhuman minds, a shadow remained, a feeling of incompleteness that they could never quite explain or resolve. The sun, such as it was on Terra, began its descent toward the western manufactorum complexes, casting long shadows through the perpetual haze. Valen found himself in a district given over to remembrancers and historiators, those whose task was to preserve the Imperium's approved narratives, to ensure that the official version of events remained dominant over inconvenient truths and uncomfortable questions. He paused before a monument dedicated to the Primarchs, 20 pedestals arranged in a semicircle around a representation of the Emperor, but only 18 of those pedestals bore names and heraldry. 2 stood empty, marked only with numerals 7 and Exite. He looked at those empty pedestals and thought about what should have been there, not in their place but in addition to them. Another gap in the record that went unmarked and unacknowledged. Alessandra's absence was more complete than her censured brother's, her erasure so thorough that not even an empty pedestal remained to mark where she should have stood. It was as though the Emperor had decided that acknowledging even the existence of that gap would be too dangerous, that the questions it would provoke were more threatening than the questions raised by the 2 officially censured Primarchs. What did that suggest about her crime? About the reason for her removal from history? The 2nd and the 11th had been purged for failures of loyalty or competence, or so the fragments of remaining evidence suggested, but Alessandra had not failed. She had succeeded in her own way, had remained true to her principles even unto death, had chosen to die rather than compromise her beliefs. That was not failure, not by any reasonable definition, but it was perhaps something more dangerous than failure. It was the suggestion that the Emperor's vision was not the only possible path, that alternatives existed which might claim moral superiority even if they were strategically untenable, and that suggestion, that hint that humanity's current course was chosen rather than inevitable, was more subversive than any amount of simple betrayal. Valen continued walking, his destination now consciously chosen rather than the random wandering of a troubled mind. The Librarius Historicus maintained a collection of sealed records, documents deemed too sensitive for general access, but too historically significant to destroy completely. He had clearance to enter those archives, though accessing specific documents required approval from multiple administrative layers and triggered attention from the Inquisition's ever-watchful observers. But there were ways to navigate those systems, methods of research that drew minimal scrutiny if conducted properly and with patience. He would plant his clues there, among documents that were already flagged as sensitive, adding marginal notes and cross-references that would only be meaningful to someone who already suspected the truth. A mention of gene seed wastage that did not align with recorded casualty figures. A reference to Legion assignments that showed 20 formations rather than 19. A fragment of a speech by Malcador the Sigillite that contained one more pronoun than the recorded number of Primarchs would justify. Small things, easily dismissed as clerical errors or corruption in ancient data matrices, but collectively forming a pattern that might, someday, lead another researcher to ask the questions Valen had asked, to seek the answers he had found, to learn about Alessandra and the choice she had made and the future she represented that had been stillborn in the flames of a compliant galaxy. The work would take years, perhaps decades, but Valen was patient. Scholars always were. They understood that truth was not always immediately apparent, that sometimes it required time and accumulated evidence to emerge from the shadows where official narratives had buried it. And the truth of Alessandra, he believed, was worth preserving, even if only as a shadow, even if only as a question that could never be conclusively answered. As he entered the Librarius Historicus, passing through security protocols and authentication rituals that had remained unchanged since the Great Crusade, Valen allowed himself one final moment of speculation. What would the Imperium look like if she had lived, if her perspective had been allowed to influence its development, if the Emperor had been willing to accommodate even one voice of dissent among his Primarchs? Would it have been stronger, more resilient, more capable of adapting to the challenges that 10,000 years of warfare had brought? Or would it have been weaker, less unified, vulnerable to the very enemies that now threatened it from all sides? The question was unanswerable, but it was worth asking, and that alone justified the risk he was taking. Because a civilization that could not ask questions about its own foundations, that could not entertain the possibility that different choices might have led to different outcomes, was a civilization that had already begun the long process of intellectual death that preceded physical extinction. He settled into his research station, calling up documents that had not been accessed in centuries, beginning the slow work of planting his seeds of doubt and curiosity. Somewhere in the distant future, he imagined another scholar would sit in this same chair, would access these same records, and would notice the inconsistencies he was carefully introducing. That scholar would begin their own investigation, would follow the trail he was laying, and perhaps, eventually, would uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. And they would learn about Alessandra, about the Primarch who chose death over compromise, about the path the Imperium did not take, and the questions that choice raised about the nature of loyalty and duty, and the price of survival in a hostile universe. They would learn, and they would tell others, and the story would spread, whispered in the dark corners where scholars gathered, debated in the sealed chambers where uncomfortable truths were carefully examined away from official scrutiny. The truth, Valen believed, could not be permanently suppressed. It might be buried, might be hidden behind layers of censorship and official denial, but it had a way of emerging, of finding voices willing to speak it even at great personal cost. Alessandra had spoken her truth in defiance of the Emperor himself, had paid for that truth with her life, and the least he could do was ensure that her choice, her sacrifice, was not completely forgotten. Outside the librarius, terror continued its endless rotation, billions of souls going about their daily functions in service to an Imperium they barely understood, built on foundations they never questioned. They did not know about Alessandra, would never know unless the careful work of scholars like Valen bore fruit across the centuries. But their lives were nonetheless shaped by her absence, by the choice the Emperor had made to build his Imperium without her wisdom, without her compassion, without her willingness to ask difficult questions and demand satisfactory answers. They lived in the Imperium that had resulted from that choice, an empire of war and sacrifice and endless grinding survival, and perhaps that was the only Imperium that could have survived the galaxy as it existed. But perhaps not, and that uncertainty, that fundamental doubt about whether humanity's current path was truly the only option, was the legacy Alessandra had left behind. The seed she had planted with her death that might someday grow into something unexpected. Valen's fingers moved across the input console, making minute alterations to records that stretched back millennia, carefully crafting the trail that future researchers might follow. The work was meticulous, demanding absolute precision to avoid triggering the automated monitoring systems that watched for heretical alterations to approved narratives. But he had spent 47 years learning these systems, understanding their blind spots and their limitations, and he knew how to move within them without attracting undue attention. Hours passed, the dim lighting of the librarius never changing, no distinction between day and night in the eternal present of scholarly research. Valen worked through the fatigue that came with age and augmentation, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended his own survival or comfort. This was important, perhaps the most important thing he would ever do, and if it cost him his life, if the Inquisition eventually traced these alterations back to him and rendered judgment for his heresy, then that would be a price worth paying. Alessandra had paid with her life for her principles. The least he could do was risk his own for hers. The archives held countless secrets, layers upon layers of suppressed information and classified documents that painted a picture of Imperial history far more complex than the simplified narratives taught to the masses. But even among those secrets, even among the darkest truths about the Imperium's foundation and the choices that had shaped its development, Alessandra's story stood out as uniquely tragic, uniquely significant. She had been the one who asked the question that could not be answered, who had demanded a justification for the Imperium's fundamental premise and found the explanations lacking. And rather than accept a worldview she could not reconcile with her own sense of morality, she had chosen to remove herself from the equation. To die in protest against a system that left no room for mercy or second chances. It was, Valen thought, the most Primarch thing possible. That absolute commitment to principle regardless of cost, that willingness to sacrifice everything for an ideal, even when the ideal itself was doomed. Her brothers had shown the same quality in their various ways, whether in loyalty or betrayal, in victory or defeat. But Alessandra's sacrifice had been different, aimed not at any external enemy, but at the very structure of the Imperium itself, a protest against the foundation upon which everything else was built. And the Emperor had responded by erasing her completely, removing even the acknowledgement of her existence, ensuring that no one would ever be inspired by her example. No one would ever ask themselves whether there might have been another way, whether mercy and extermination might somehow have coexisted in the early Imperium's policy toward the Xenos. The answer, Valen suspected, was probably no. The galaxy was too hostile, humanity too vulnerable, the alien threats too diverse and too implacable to allow for the kind of nuanced approach Alessandra had embodied. But probably was not the same as certainly, and the fact that the question had never been truly tested, that Alessandra's path had been foreclosed before it could even be attempted, meant that humanity would never know whether a different future might have been possible. That ignorance, that foreclosed possibility, was perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Not Alessandra's death itself, which had been her choice, and which she had faced with courage and conviction, but the death of the alternative she represented, the future that might have been if the Emperor had been willing to accommodate even one dissenting voice among his Primarchs. Valen completed his work as the Terran night cycle reached its deepest point, the city outside falling into a relative quiet that passed for silence on a world of countless billions. He sealed the alterations, encoding them with authorization markers that would pass automated scrutiny while remaining just slightly irregular enough to trigger curiosity in any researcher who looked closely. It was a delicate balance, but one he had practiced over years of archival manipulation, and he was confident the trail would hold until someone with the wit and courage to follow it came along. Rising from his station, joints protesting the long period of immobility, he made his way through the empty corridors of the Librarius, past shelves that held the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of Imperial history, past sealed vaults that contained secrets darker than the one he carried. The weight of what he knew felt physical, a pressure in his chest that his augmetic heart struggled to process. But it was a weight he would carry until death or discovery relieved him of it. Terra's streets were never truly empty, even in the deepest night, but they were quieter now, populated mostly by servitors carrying out their programmed tasks and the occasional adept working a shift that defied normal circadian rhythms. Valen walked among them, anonymous in his administratum robes, just another functionary in an Imperium built on the backs of countless billions of such functionaries. But he carried something they did not, a truth that had the power to shake the foundations of everything they believed, a story that challenged the very premises upon which the Imperium stood. Alessandra had existed, had lived and chosen and died for principles that transcended mere survival, and that existence mattered even if it had been officially erased, even if acknowledging it was heresy of the deepest kind. The question she had asked, "Why must they die?" echoed in his mind as he walked. It was a simple question, the kind a child might ask, but its implications were vast and terrible and unanswerable within the framework of Imperial doctrine. The official answer was because they are not human, because they threaten humanity's survival, because the Emperor in his wisdom has decreed it necessary. But those answers begged further questions, created new doubts that could not be easily resolved. Alessandra had seen those doubts, had faced them directly rather than hiding behind doctrine and necessity, and her inability to resolve them had led to her death. She was the Primarch of unanswered questions, of paths not taken, of the alternatives the Imperium had rejected in its single-minded pursuit of human supremacy and survival. And now, 10,000 years later, as the Imperium groaned under the weight of endless war and gradual decay, as the light of the Astronomicon flickered and dimmed, As enemies pressed in from all sides, and the very fabric of reality seemed to fray at the edges, those unanswered questions felt more relevant than ever. Had the Emperor been right to build his Imperium on such uncompromising foundations? Had the cost of human survival been worth the price in mercy and moral flexibility? Would a more tolerant Imperium have survived long enough to face the challenges that now threatened it? The questions were unanswerable, but they were worth asking, and Alessandra's story, however fragmentary and suppressed, provided a framework for asking them. She was the symbol of the path not taken, the reminder that the Imperium as it existed was the result of choices rather than inevitability, that things might have been different if different decisions had been made at critical junctures. Valen reached his hab unit as the first grey light of Terran dawn began to penetrate the smog layers, exhausted but satisfied with the night's work. He had done what he could to preserve Alessandra's memory, to ensure that her story would not be completely lost, that future generations might learn about the Primarch who had died rather than compromise her principles. The rest was beyond his control, dependent on whether anyone would find the trail he had laid, whether they would have the courage to follow it, whether the truth he had uncovered would ever emerge from the shadows where it had been buried for so long. Sleep came slowly, his mind still racing with implications and possibilities, with the weight of forbidden knowledge that no amount of mental discipline could completely suppress. In his dreams he saw her, though he had no idea what she truly looked like beyond the fragmentary descriptions in the ancient document. His mind constructed an image anyway, assembling it from those scattered details and his own imagination, giving form to the Primarch who existed only as absence, only as the hole in history where she should have stood. She was tall in his dream as all Primarchs were tall, but her height seemed less an expression of dominance and more a natural consequence of her impossible biology. Her features were sharp and elegant, eyes the color of autumn leaves, and she wore armor that was neither the ornate baroque of Fulgrim nor the brutal functionalism of Perturabo, but something else entirely, something that suggested protection without aggression, strength without brutality. On her shoulder guard, where her brothers bore the heraldry of their legions, she wore a symbol he did not recognize, something that looked like a bridge spanning a chasm, connecting two shores that should have been forever separate. She looked at him in the dream with those autumn eyes, and though she did not speak, he understood what she was asking him, the same question she had asked the Emperor and his delegations all those millennia ago. Why must they die? Why must the galaxy burn? Why must survival require the abandonment of everything that makes survival worthwhile? And like the Emperor before him, like all the functionaries and soldiers and administrators who had built the Imperium on foundations of necessary cruelty, Valen had no answer that satisfied her. He could only offer the same justifications, the same appeals to necessity and survival, the same insistence that the galaxy left humanity no choice. And in his dream, she looked at him with infinite sadness and turned away, walking back into the darkness from which she had emerged, leaving him alone with his inadequate explanations and his unanswered questions. He woke with the sensation of loss, as though he had actually known her and watched her die, though of course he had done neither. She had been dead for 10,000 years before he was born, had been erased from history so thoroughly that until yesterday he had not even suspected her existence. But the dream had made her real to him in a way the document's dry recitation of facts had not, had transformed her from an abstract historical curiosity into something that felt like a person, a consciousness that had existed and made choices and suffered consequences. The grief he felt was irrational, mourning someone he had never met, but it was also genuine, a recognition of the magnitude of what had been lost when Alessandra died in that crystal plaza. Not just a Primarch, not just a military asset or a political tool, but a genuinely different perspective, a voice that might have changed the Imperium's trajectory if it had been allowed to speak. Valen's daily routines continued as normal, his duties in the administratum requiring the same meticulous attention they always had. processing documents and verifying records and maintaining the vast bureaucratic machinery that kept the Imperium functioning. But beneath that surface normalcy, his thoughts kept returning to Alessandra, to the questions her existence raised, to the implications of her erasure from history. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked, small inconsistencies in the official narratives that took on new significance in light of what he now knew. References to the lost Primarchs that used plural forms suggesting more than two. Legion assignments that did not quite add up if only 19 Primarchs had ever commanded forces. Gene seed records that showed trace anomalies in certain chapters' bloodlines, as though their genetic heritage had been deliberately obscured or contaminated with material from an unknown source. Each discovery reinforced his conviction that Alessandra had been real, that the document he had found was genuine rather than some elaborate forgery. But each discovery also deepened the mystery of how her erasure had been accomplished, how the Emperor and his closest advisors had managed to remove every trace of her from the historical record so completely that 10,000 years of scholarship had failed to uncover the truth. The answer he gradually came to realize was that they had not completely succeeded. The document existed, which meant others might exist as well, hidden in forgotten archives or sealed vaults, waiting for researchers curious or lucky enough to find them. The inconsistencies he was noticing had always been there, had always been visible to anyone who looked closely enough and asked the right questions. The difference was that now he knew what he was looking for, had a framework for interpreting the gaps and anomalies that had previously seemed like random corruption in ancient data matrices. Alessandra's erasure had been thorough but not perfect, because perfect erasure was impossible when dealing with an entity as significant as a Primarch. She had left traces, echoes in the historical record that could not be completely eliminated no matter how determined the effort. And those traces, however fragmentary, were enough to reconstruct at least the outline of her story, enough to understand what had been lost and why it mattered. Weeks passed, then months. Valen continuing his work in the archives while slowly expanding his investigation, following leads that branched out from the original document in directions he had not anticipated. He discovered references to a legion that had been broken up and distributed among other forces before it ever saw combat, its warriors reassigned without explanation and their original heraldry struck from all records. He found cryptic notes in Malcador the Sigillite's personal journals, heavily redacted but suggesting a disagreement between the Emperor and one of his children, a dispute that had ended not in censure or punishment, but in something described only as necessary severance. Each piece of evidence was fragmentary, ambiguous enough to be dismissed individually as clerical error or misinterpretation. But collectively they painted a picture that aligned with what the original document had described. Alessandra had commanded a legion, or had been preparing to command one, and when she died that legion had been quietly dismantled, its warriors scattered among her brother's forces where they would be absorbed and their origins forgotten. Valen tried to imagine what that legion might have been like. What kind of warriors would have served a Primarch designed for synthesis and diplomacy rather than conquest and domination? They would have been space marines, certainly genetically enhanced super soldiers with all the brutal capabilities that implied. But perhaps they would have been trained differently, taught to see the Xenos as potential negotiating partners rather than targets for bolter rounds, given skills in linguistics and cultural analysis alongside their combat training. The idea was almost laughable in the context of the current Imperium, where space marines were weapons of war and nothing else, where the very concept of negotiating with Xenos was grounds for execution as a heretic. But in the early Crusade, before doctrine had hardened into dogma, before the Horus Heresy had proven the dangers of ideological flexibility, perhaps such a legion had been viable, had represented a genuine attempt to create warriors who could bridge the gap between humanity and the alien. And when Alessandra died, when her vision proved incompatible with the Imperium's emerging character, that legion had been erased along with her, broken up and scattered so completely that even their brothers in arms forgot they had ever existed as a distinct formation. It was a tragedy compounded upon tragedy. Not just the loss of a Primarch, but the loss of everyone and everything associated with her, an entire military tradition and philosophical approach eliminated from history. The more Valen learned, the more he came to appreciate the magnitude of what the Emperor had done. The sheer determination required to erase a Primarch from existence so completely that 10,000 years of scholarship had failed to uncover the truth. It spoke to resources and capabilities that even most high-ranking Imperial officials could barely comprehend. The ability to reach across an entire galaxy and eliminate every trace of an individual from countless records and memories and physical artifacts. But it also spoke to fear. Valen realized. The Emperor had not gone to such extraordinary lengths simply to punish disobedience or eliminate a failed experiment. He had done it because Alessandra represented something dangerous, not to his power but to his vision, not to the Imperium's survival but to its ideological coherence. She had asked questions that could not be answered within the framework of Imperial doctrine, had demanded justifications that could not be provided without admitting fundamental uncertainties about humanity's path forward. And so she had been eliminated, removed not just from physical existence but from the historical record, erased so thoroughly that no one would ever be inspired by her example. No one would ever wonder whether there might have been another way, whether mercy and survival might have been compatible if anyone had been willing to try. The realization filled Valen with a complex mixture of emotions, grief for what had been lost, but also a kind of bitter admiration for the determination required to achieve such complete erasure. The Emperor had made a choice, had decided that the Imperium could not afford the luxury of moral ambiguity, and he had followed through on that choice with absolute conviction, accepting the cost in truth and memory that it required. Whether that choice had been right, whether the Imperium would have been stronger or weaker with Alessandra's voice included in its councils, was impossible to determine. The experiment had never been run. The alternative timeline had been foreclosed before it could develop, and all that remained was speculation and unanswerable questions. But those questions, Valen believed, were worth preserving, worth passing on to future generations, even if they could never be satisfactorily resolved. Because a civilization that could not question its own foundations, that could not entertain the possibility of alternative paths, was a civilization that had sacrificed its capacity for growth and adaptation in favor of rigid adherence to doctrine. The Imperium, 10,000 years after Alessandra's death, was showing the consequences of that choice. It was vast and powerful but also brittle, capable of tremendous violence but unable to adapt to changing circumstances, locked into patterns of behavior that had been established in the early Crusade and never seriously reconsidered. The enemies it faced evolved and adapted, learning from each encounter and developing new strategies, while the Imperium ground forward with the same tactics it had used for millennia, trusting in weight of numbers and depth of faith to compensate for lack of innovation. Would Alessandra have made a difference if she had lived? Would her perspective have introduced flexibility and adaptability into the Imperium's character, creating a civilization capable of learning and changing rather than simply enduring? Or would her approach have been overwhelmed by the galaxy's hostility, her attempts at mercy and understanding exploited by enemies who recognized no such virtues themselves? The questions spiraled endlessly in Valen's mind, each answer suggesting new questions, each conclusion revealing new uncertainties. But that, he thought, was appropriate. Alessandra had been the Primarch of unanswered questions, of paths not taken, and it was fitting that her legacy should be doubt rather than certainty, curiosity rather than conviction. As the months stretched toward a year, Valen's investigation deepened, taking him into corners of Imperial history that few scholars ever explored. He discovered fragments of early Crusade poetry that referenced a sister-in-arms among the Primarchs, lines that had been dismissed as metaphorical or mistranslated, but which took on new significance in light of what he knew. He found artwork from the Unification Wars era that depicted 21 figures surrounding the emperor rather than the 19 that official iconography showed. The extra figures' faces deliberately obscured or damaged in ways that suggested intentional defacement rather than random deterioration. Each discovery was small, individually insignificant, but collectively they formed a pattern that could not be easily dismissed. Alessandra had existed, had been part of the early Imperium's development, and her removal had left scars in the historical record that 10,000 years had not completely healed. Valen began to wonder whether he was the first to discover this truth, or merely the latest in a long line of scholars who had uncovered, and then suppressed or been suppressed for what they found. Perhaps every generation produced a few individuals curious enough to follow the trail, dedicated enough to piece together the fragmentary evidence, and the Inquisition or the Administratum or some other imperial agency quietly eliminated them before they could spread their dangerous knowledge further. The thought was sobering but not surprising. The Imperium had survived for 10,000 years by being absolutely ruthless about eliminating threats to its ideological coherence, and the truth about Alessandra was exactly such a threat. If her story became widely known, if the masses learned that the Emperor himself had censored a Primarch not for betrayal or failure, but for asking uncomfortable questions, it could undermine faith in the entire Imperial project. And faith was all the Imperium had left, really. Its technology was decaying, its institutions were corrupt, its territories were besieged from all sides by enemies who seemed to grow stronger while humanity grew weaker. Only faith held the whole creaking structure together. Faith in the Emperor and the rightness of his vision, and the necessity of humanity's endless war for survival. Remove that faith, and the entire Imperium might collapse into the kind of internecine warfare that had characterized the Age of Strife. So perhaps the suppression of Alessandra's story was justified, perhaps maintaining that lie was necessary for humanity's survival, but Valen found he could not quite accept that conclusion. A civilization built on lies, no matter how necessary those lies might seem, was a civilization that had already lost something essential, some core of integrity that made survival worthwhile rather than merely expedient. He thought about Alessandra facing the Emperor in that crystal plaza, refusing to accept the justifications for genocide that should have been compelling to any rational analysis. She had not been stupid or naive, had understood the threats humanity faced and the necessities of survival in a hostile galaxy. But she had also understood that survival at any cost was not really survival at all. That becoming monsters in order to fight monsters meant losing the very things that made humanity worth preserving. The Emperor had rejected that argument, had insisted that survival came first and morality could be addressed later, once humanity was secure. But later had never come, Valen realized. The Imperium had never become secure enough to afford moral considerations, had never reached a point where it could relax its brutal pragmatism and consider whether its methods aligned with its stated values. The war had simply continued, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, until no one could remember what they were fighting for beyond simple survival, beyond the continuation of the fight itself. Alessandra had seen that future, or something like it, had recognized that the path the Emperor was choosing led to an Imperium that would survive, but only as a hollow shell of what humanity could have been, and she had refused to participate, had chosen death rather than complicity, had left behind only questions and absence, and the faint traces in the historical record that Valen was now laboriously documenting. His work continued through the following months, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He accumulated evidence carefully, storing copies in multiple locations encrypted with protocols that would make them accessible to future researchers while protecting them from immediate discovery by Imperial authorities. He prepared a comprehensive analysis of everything he had learned, a document that laid out the case for Alessandra's existence and her significance to Imperial history, written in language that was careful and scholarly, but could not completely hide the revolutionary implications of what he was describing. And through it all, he waited for the inevitable knock on his door, the arrival of inquisitorial agents come to silence him as they had presumably silenced others before him. He took precautions but did not delude himself that they would be sufficient if the Inquisition truly wanted him dead. The organization had resources and capabilities that made hiding impossible for anyone who had drawn their serious attention, and what he was doing certainly qualified as heresy of the most profound sort. But the knock never came, and gradually Valen began to suspect that perhaps his precautions were more effective than he had dared hope. Or perhaps the authorities who monitored such things had calculated that allowing him to continue was less dangerous than the attention his disappearance might draw. He was, after all, just one elderly scholar working in obscure corners of Imperial history, producing research that no one outside a tiny academic community would ever read or care about. Perhaps that made him beneath the Inquisition's notice, too small a threat to warrant the resources necessary to eliminate him. Or perhaps they were simply waiting, watching to see where his investigation led and who else it might implicate before moving to shut it down. That possibility kept him cautious, made him careful about whom he contacted and what he said in any communication that might be monitored. But it did not stop him from continuing his work, from following the trail of evidence wherever it led, from slowly building a case that he hoped would survive, even if he did not. The second year of his investigation brought a new discovery, one that changed his understanding of Alessandra's story in fundamental ways. He found, buried in a sealed archive that required 3 levels of authorization to access, a fragment of what appeared to be her own writing, a personal journal or record of some kind that had somehow survived the purge. The text was encrypted, protected by algorithms that had taken him weeks to crack even with access to the administratum's most sophisticated cogitators. But when he finally broke through the protections and read what lay beneath, the words struck him with physical force. She had known, the journal revealed, had known that her stance would lead to her death, that the Emperor would not yield on the question of Xeno's extermination, that her principles were incompatible with the Imperium's survival as he envisioned it. She had calculated the odds with a Primarch's superhuman intellect, had wargamed every possible scenario and found no outcome where both she and her adopted people survived. And having reached that conclusion, she had chosen to make her death mean something, to transform it from a pointless tragedy into a protest that might, someday, inspire someone to ask the questions she had asked and demand better answers than the ones she had received. "They will erase me," she had written in flowing script that suggested a hand far more delicate than her brother's brutal efficiency with pen and parchment. "Father will ensure that no trace remains, that no one will remember I existed or question the path he has chosen. But erasure is never complete. Somewhere, somehow, fragments will survive. Someone will find them and wonder. Someone will ask why. And perhaps in 10,000 years or 10 million, humanity will be strong enough to hear the answer and wise enough to act upon it. Until then, I leave this: the question is more important than the answer, and mercy is not weakness even when it costs everything." Valen read those words until they were burned into his memory, until he could recite them perfectly even in the depths of sleep. This was Alessandra's real legacy. Not the military victories she never won or the worlds she never brought to compliance, but this simple insistence that the questions mattered, that humanity should never stop asking whether its path was the right one even when survival seemed to require absolute certainty. It was a radical idea, almost treasonous in its implications, but it was also profoundly human in a way the current Imperium had largely forgotten. Doubt and questioning were treated as weaknesses, as doors through which corruption could enter, but Alessandra had recognized them as strengths, as the essential characteristics that allowed intelligence to adapt and grow rather than calcifying into rigid patterns that could not respond to changing circumstances. Armed with this new understanding, Valen returned to his analysis of Imperial history with fresh eyes, looking for the moments when doubt and questioning had been suppressed in favor of certainty and conviction, tracing how that suppression had shaped the Imperium's development over millennia. What he found was a pattern of progressive hardening, of flexibility giving way to rigidity, of pragmatism being replaced by dogma. The early crusade had been brutal but also adaptable, willing to try new approaches and learn from failure. The Imperium of the 41st millennium was merely brutal, locked into patterns established millennia before and unable to deviate from them, even when those patterns clearly no longer served their original purposes. Alessandra's death, or more precisely the suppression of what she represented, had been a turning point in that process. By eliminating her and erasing her from history, the Emperor had sent a message to all his remaining children, and to the Imperium at large there was one acceptable path, one correct answer to the question of humanity's future, and deviation from that path would not be tolerated even from his most beloved creations. The message had been received and internalized, becoming part of the Imperium's foundational character in ways that shaped everything that followed. The Horus Heresy, when it came, had only reinforced that rigidity. Half the Primarchs turning traitor proved, to those who survived, that ideological flexibility was dangerous, that allowing doubt or questioning created opportunities for corruption. Better to demand absolute faith and punish any deviation harshly than to risk another betrayal of that magnitude. And so the Imperium had become increasingly inflexible, increasingly intolerant of anything that challenged its core assumptions, until by the current age it was almost completely incapable of adaptation or innovation. Would Alessandra's survival have prevented that? Probably not, Valen admitted to himself. One voice among 20, even a Primarch's voice, would likely have been insufficient to counter the trauma of the heresy and the lessons the survivors drew from it. But perhaps she would have preserved some space for questioning, some recognition that certainty was not always strength and doubt was not always weakness. Perhaps her presence would have kept alive the idea that the Imperium's path was chosen rather than inevitable, that alternatives existed and deserved consideration even if they were ultimately rejected. That space, that recognition, that idea might have made all the difference, might have created an Imperium capable of adapting to the challenges of the 41st millennium, rather than simply enduring them, might have allowed humanity to evolve rather than simply survive. But that possibility had died with Alessandra in the Crystal Plaza, and the Imperium that resulted was the one that now groaned under the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated rigidity and decay. Valen's investigation eventually produced a document of several hundred pages, a comprehensive analysis that laid out everything he had discovered about Alessandra and what her erasure meant for Imperial history. He had no illusions about being able to publish it through official channels or even through the semi-legitimate academic presses that served the Imperium's scholarly community. This was heresy in its purest form, a direct challenge to fundamental Imperial doctrine that would result in his immediate execution if it came to the wrong people's attention. But he had prepared copies, hidden them in archives and databases across Terra and beyond, encrypted them with protocols that would make them accessible to future researchers while protecting them from immediate discovery. He had ensured that the trail he had followed would remain visible to anyone curious enough to look for it, that the questions Alessandra had asked would not be completely silenced even if he was. And then he waited, continuing his normal duties while watching for any sign that his heresy had been discovered, that the Inquisition was moving against him. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and still no knock came on his door. Either his precautions were more effective than he had dared hope, or someone was allowing him to continue for reasons of their own. But either way he remained free to complete his work. In the end, it was not the Inquisition that came for him, but something far more mundane. Age and augmentation failure, his heart half organic tissue and half mechanical components, finally succumbed to the strain of nearly 5 decades of service and 2 years of intense stress and worry. He died at his desk in the archives, slumped over a data slate containing the latest version of his analysis, surrounded by the fragmentary evidence of a truth that the Imperium had tried to bury for 10 millennia. They found him the next morning, the junior adepts who shared his section of the Administratum complex, and after the initial shock and the necessary reporting to superiors, They began the process of cataloging his work and determining what should be preserved and what could be safely discarded. Most of his research was routine, the kind of archival analysis that characterized any long career in the administratum. But buried among those routine documents were the seeds he had planted, the trail markers he had left for future researchers to follow. Some of those markers would be discovered, examined, and discarded as clerical errors or the confused musings of an aging mind. But others would survive, would be noticed by sharp-eyed scholars who wondered at the inconsistencies they revealed, who followed the trail Valen had laid and found themselves asking the same questions he had asked. And eventually, perhaps decades or centuries from now, someone would piece together enough of the evidence to understand what he had discovered, to learn about Alessandra and the choice she had made and the future her death had foreclosed. That knowledge would spread slowly, carefully, shared in whispers among scholars who understood the danger it represented but also recognized its importance. It would never become official history, never be taught in the Schola Progenium or preached from the pulpits of the ecclesiarchy, but it would survive as a kind of shadow history, an alternative narrative that existed alongside the official accounts and challenged them simply by existing. And in that survival, in that persistent questioning of the Imperium's foundations, Alessandra's legacy would endure. She had asked why, had demanded justification for the brutality that seemed to define humanity's future, had refused to accept that survival required the abandonment of mercy and moral consideration. The Imperium had not answered her question satisfactorily, had instead tried to eliminate it by eliminating her, but the question itself was immortal, recurring in every generation among those brave or foolish enough to examine the foundations of their civilization and wonder whether things might have been different. 10,000 years after her death, Alessandra remained what she had always been, a gap in the record, an absence that shaped the narrative by not being part of it, a question that could not be answered, but also could not be forgotten. The Imperium had erased her from official history, but could not erase what she represented, could not eliminate the possibility that another path might have existed if anyone had been willing to walk it. And so the story persisted, passed down through fragments and whispers, and the dedicated work of scholars like Valen who risk everything to preserve a truth that the Imperium had deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. Alessandra had died, but the question she asked lived on, waiting for a time when humanity might finally be strong enough to hear it and wise enough to answer it honestly. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there was only war and the slow decay of everything humanity had built, that question represented something precious and rare, a hope, not the false hope of easy victory or miraculous salvation, but the genuine hope that comes from recognizing that the future is not predetermined, that choices matter, that humanity could still become something other than what it currently was, if enough people were willing to ask the right questions and demand better answers than the ones they had been given. Alessandra had been the Primarch of that hope, however briefly, however tragically. And though she was gone, though her name had been struck from every record, and her memory suppressed with determination that bordered on the fanatical, what she represented could not be killed as easily as a physical body. The idea persisted, the question endured, and somewhere in the vast archives and forgotten corners of the Imperium, the evidence of her existence waited for new generations to discover it and wonder what might have been if she had lived, if her voice had been allowed to speak, if the Emperor had chosen a different path when faced with her uncompromising idealism. The galaxy turned, wars raged and empires fell, and the Imperium ground forward through millennia of suffering and sacrifice, but beneath it all, unacknowledged and officially non-existent, Alessandra's question echoed through history like a bell that could not be unrung: why must they die? And in the silence that followed that question, in the absence of any satisfactory answer, lay the seed of every doubt and every hope that had survived 10,000 years of imperial doctrine. She had existed, she had chosen, she had died, and in dying, she had ensured that the question would outlive her. would persist in the foundations of Imperial history like a fault line waiting for the right pressure to reveal itself. Someday, perhaps, that pressure would come. Someday humanity might be ready to examine its foundations honestly and admit that the path it had taken was not the only one available, that alternatives had existed and might exist still if anyone had the courage to seek them. Until that day, Alessandra would remain what the Emperor had made her: a gap in the record, a name that appeared in no official history, a Primarch who had never existed according to every source that mattered. But to those few who knew the truth, who had followed the trail of evidence through archives and whispers and fragmentary documents, she was something else entirely. She was proof that the Imperium's certainty was not as absolute as it claimed, that doubt and questioning had a place even in the grim darkness of the far future, that mercy was not weakness even when it cost everything. She was the 11th, though no record would admit it. She was Alessandra, though no one spoke her name. She was the question that could not be answered, and the hope that could not be killed. And in the endless war that defined humanity's existence in the 41st millennium, that was perhaps the most important legacy any Primarch could leave behind.